Hello and welcome to Mekelle Foresight. This is Mekelle, producer and host of the show. With me today is Goitom Gebreluel. He's a political analyst working on the Horn of Africa. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Cambridge. Goitom Gebreluel, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, after assuming a new mandate with his swearing in on Monday, Abiy Ahmed has proceeded to form his own cabinet. How different is his new government in terms of representation of the, breadth and width of the various constituencies and political dispensations in the country?
Thank you, Manasi. I think what we see from the cabinet is there's an inclusion of opposition parties to the cabinet, and the choice of people is very interesting. It clearly shows that he has allied himself with right-wing unitary Ethiopian nationalists and Amhara nationalists primarily. We've known this for a long time, and they've been at the forefront of supporting Abiy Ahmed. Many of them have acted as if they're in opposition, but this week's decision to include them in the cabinet shows that that was merely a formality and that they, in fact, share the same worldview as Abiy Ahmed and he shares theirs, and that they've been working together, essentially. So this is really a clear evidence of the right-wing turn that Ethiopia's Prosperity Party has taken. These people have the same views on Ethiopia's constitution. They have similar views on Ethiopia's history, and it very much goes against that of former EPRDF and, of course, many of the different ethno-nationalist opposition groups around the country, such as the Oromo Liberation Front and the Ogaden National Liberation Front, and so forth.
Okay, so there's talk of, trying to change the constitution currently. If this happens, how do you think will impact the political process in the country?
Well, this sort of relates to what we just talked about. So one of the demands from this right-wing constituency is that the constitution changes, and that's been clearly formulated by Birhanu Negga's Izema and their supporters and the broader unitary nationalist camp. Now, this is a very significant decision if it's made, and it's more likely to be made than not. The implication of that will be that the last sort of line that keeps the bond that keeps the different nations and nationalities in Ethiopia together will break. What a lot of people misunderstand about the current constitution is that it's a compromise. In 1991, the Ogaden National Liberation Front and the OLF and various other organizations were seriously considering secession. And this constitution was a sort of middle ground for us to stay together. Now, a lot happened in those 27 years that the EPRDF governed Ethiopia. There were many mistakes that were made. Ethiopia wasn't able to fully democratize, and so forth. On the other hand, there was also a great deal of development. But I think the one thing that most Ethiopians genuinely appreciated was that 1995 constitution. And what a lot of people were expecting from this reform in 2018, this so-called reform, was that the democratic element of that constitution would be applied. Now, if there's a reversal on that process and there's a decision or an intention to get rid of that constitution, then we simply have nothing that holds us together. I think for Tigrayans, we actually de facto have very little that keeps us together with Ethiopia at the moment. But there are a lot of Somalis, Oromos, Afar, and so forth that are at the moment ambiguous with regards to Ethiopia. And I think for those tens of millions of people, a decision on the constitution will be the straw that breaks the camel's back. Essentially, disintegration will be the only option left.
And now to the war that is raging. You've been a close observer of the war, the ongoing war, and one of the prominent commentators and analysts, of the situation. It all started as a law enforcement operation. Then it was declared over by Abiy Ahmed, which, to the surprise of many, is now calling it a campaign, a war of survival and national sovereignty. How do you characterize this ongoing war yourself?
My view is that it was not a law enforcement operation to begin with. I think that's pretty clear now, and it was also very clear from day one, because from day one there was rape, there was ethnic cleansing, there was massacres, and so forth. So this very much contradicts any notion of law enforcement. And the interesting thing was that this didn't sort of gradually build up. From the moment they set foot on Tigrayan soil, what they did was massacre, rape women, and pillage. So it's very clear that that was the intention they went in with. I think it has three there are three motivations behind it, broadly, in addition to the human rights abuses. One was that Abiy Ahmed dreams of becoming emperor, and he's made that very clear. Referred to himself as the seventh king and so forth, said that his mother told him, she prophesied that he would be the seventh king and so forth. And we've seen that he's been trying to centralize power. Certainly from 2019 onwards, it became very overt. So he wanted to become emperor and create a personalized autocracy. The Amhara elite, the Amhara nationalists in the Prosperity Party and some of the opposition wanted a dominant position for themselves in the country. And thirdly, unitary Ethiopian nationalists wanted to pursue an ideological agenda. That's where Izema and Birhanu Nega and so forth come in. And having imprisoned most of the Oromo opposition leaders and disseminated different opposition groups around the country, the last bastion left of resistance was Tigray. And essentially, the purpose of that war was a concentration of power for these groups.
So this war, as much as it is a war of drones, technologies, and human waves, is also a war of narratives, many believe, ranging from depicting the pre-2018 years as years of darkness, to demonizing one group, to rewriting the cause of the 1998 Ethio-Eritrean War as reflected in Abiy Ahmed's response to President Biden's executive order recently. How has narratives played in causing and funding the war?
Quite fascinating. As a political scientist, I've been really interested in the impact of narrative, because we know in general that narratives are important for shaping people's ideas and so forth. But in this case, the past 3 years, narrative has been an important political weapon in a way I have never seen elsewhere. So what's fascinating with Abiy Ahmed is that he is incredibly incompetent in a lot of things. One thing he's very good at is manipulating a certain section of Ethiopian society and also the international community. So he very cleverly created this narrative of himself as a reformer that took on a life of its own. So initially we weren't sure, and we were expecting reform. So a lot of us bought into the idea of reform, right? From 2019 onwards, it became clear that he was no reformer; he was an autocrat. And in 2020, it became very obvious that he was a ruthless autocrat. But the interesting thing, by that time, the idea of Abiy Ahmed as a reformer had taken on a life of its own, in particular in the West. And despite engaging in atrocities, despite engaging in the worst forms of violence and being a clear mass murderer, that narrative had really taken root inside the minds of most of the West, I would say. And we saw throughout this war that it took nearly a year for to be able to change that perception of Abiy Ahmed as a reformer. So that's one way narrative has been very important. Another way is the way as soon as he came to power, he's been building a lot of fear in Ethiopian society. So there were all these assassinations, there were violence in different parts of the country, and if you noticed, the state media would consistently refer to unknown enemies and really sort of build up this collective psychology of being under siege and facing an existential threat. And he did that very effectively for 2 years. So by the time the war on Tigray began, he had very cleverly, very effectively built up a psychology amongst many Ethiopians that was really characterized by an existential fear. And then he presented, of course, Tigrayans as the great enemy and himself as the savior. And the outcome of that was that the Ethiopian people, I wouldn't say the Ethiopian people, I would say sections of the Ethiopian people, and particularly in Addis Ababa and in the Amhara region, essentially wrote him a blank check and said, you're free to do whatever you want. And so I think Abiy Ahmed's biggest weapon so far has been narrative. And it's really been able to compensate for his extreme incompetence. It's quite fascinating that a man that makes a blunder every week there's a big blunder, every week there's a defeat, every week there's something that goes wrong that can be attributed to bad leadership, gets away with that because of these ideas that is instilled in people's minds. So it's been very fascinating to observe how important narratives have been in this war.
And as a result of that, taking into consideration the atrocities that happened over the last 10 months, the continued total blockade, the use of starvation and sexual violence as a weapon of war, the forcing out of Tigrayans from swathes of their territory in western Tigray, ethnic profiling in Addis and other parts of the country. All these have they contributed to, surely they have contributed to, they have a socio-political cost. To what extent are they taking a toll on the social fabric of the country?
Put it simply, they have devastated what was left, because we have to consider that Ethiopia is a country that has centuries of abuse behind it. It has centuries of intercommunal violence, and there were a lot of wounds that were quite clearly open. And so it comes in that context. And it was really, I have to say that the violence and the hypocrisy that we witnessed throughout the year have been limitless. What we've seen is that there's an elite in that country that doesn't have a red line. There's an elite that really does not have any sort of limitations in terms of types of human rights abuses and mass murder that it can tolerate. Millions of millions dying is something that they can live with. As millions of people are starving in Ethiopia today, just this week we saw that elite celebrate the coronation of an emperor, and with no regard for the well-being of other Ethiopians. So this is the context, and the outcome of this is, of course, that the few bonds that kept us together are now totally severed. And I don't think that elite appreciates the consequences that this will have. I suspect that they think that this is something that people will get over in a year or two, that we will sort of let bygones be bygones and it will be forgotten. And they seem to be incapable of appreciating the gravity of genocide, appreciating the gravity of ethnic cleansing, appreciating the gravity of mass rape. There are going to be tens of millions of people who have been affected by rape, who have been affected by different types of violence committed by the state over the past 2 years. And it's going to have repercussions for generations, I think. Obviously, we're going to live together in that region. Physical separation is going to be impossible. We're going to have to live together as neighbors. But this is really something that's going to imprint itself in the minds of people for generations to come. And it's really fascinating to see that the elite in Addis Ababa don't appreciate the gravity of what's going on.
The international community, many countries, many international organizations have been pushing for negotiation, while the warring actors remain at loggerheads and resolved to fight it out, as opposed, of course, to the internal pressure, which is absent, almost absent. I want you to comment on that. Why do you think is no, pressure for negotiation from inside? Because that is clearly missing. Everybody seems to be on the other side, polarizing the situation. Do you see also if there are any conditions for negotiation now in Ethiopia?
On your first question, it's interesting. There is one group, the Federalists, that we can call them the Federalists, that have been sidelined, whose leaders are in jail, whose people are being persecuted and murdered and butchered. This category of political actors want negotiation. The other ones, the unitary nationalists that are in power and that are quite dominant in Addis Ababa, they've taken power by force. They're enjoying that privilege, and they seem to be reluctant to give that up unless they're forced off the throne, essentially. So the reason that we're not seeing a push for negotiations from within Ethiopia is that it's essentially a fight for privilege. There's one group of people that have total control of the state and are using state power recklessly, and they seem to be really committed to maintaining that. And also there's, I think, a psychological, cultural dimension behind it. There seems to be a sense of entitlement. I'm quite fascinated by the fact that they are offended by our demand for democracy. They are offended by demand for legitimate, fair elections. They are offended by the demand for being able to mobilize and organize politically. So a sense of entitlement is an important factor here. And they're also, as I said, in it until the end. So I don't see any other way than them being forced to the negotiation table. through military means, essentially. And they show that on a daily basis. There is no remorse. You know, millions of people are starving today, and there is absolutely no remorse amongst the elite in Addis Ababa. There is no appetite for considering the pain they go through, or reconsidering some of the decisions that have been made in the past year. So clearly, there is no other option but to force them to the negotiating table.
The permanent representative of Kenya in the United Nations Security Council, Ambassador Martin Kimani, in a statement he made in the UN Security Council on 26 August on behalf of the AS3+1, said, and I quote, "It's not easy to move from violent confrontation to the negotiating table. This was why on the 2nd July, we recommended use of the mechanisms available in Africa's peace and security architecture, underpinned by our constitutive act. Foremost among these mechanisms, and that is available to Ethiopia immediately, is the right of member states to request intervention from the Union in order to restore peace and security." What could be this intervention about? Please shed more light on the nature of this right of status in the African Union.
So a country that is facing civil war or any other problem can request the African Union to intervene to mediate or provide any form of political support. But that requires willingness, and the willingness is lacking on two fronts. On the one hand, the Ethiopian government obviously rebuffed African Union mediators in November, and really, kept them at a distance since then also. But also the head of the African Union Commission, Moussa Faki, has also been pretty reluctant to issue an agenda and pressure Ethiopia. So this requires political will, both from Ethiopia, the African Union, and other African countries. That's essentially totally lacking.
The same statement also said the TPLF must leave no doubts lingering that they will ever play any part in compromising the political independence and territorial integrity of Ethiopia, which all members of the African Union are obliged to defend. End of quote. Where is this coming from, in your opinion? We have heard the TDF leadership repeatedly saying, which also includes TPLF, that the future of Tigray will be decided by the people of Tigray, and that the TDF's objective is to create the necessary conditions for the people to exercise this constitutional right of the people of Ethiopia and of the people of Tigray, of course, to self-determination. Where does the AU stand with respect to this right to self-determination? To what extent does the continental body's charter's non-violability clause stand, even after Eritrea and South Sudan, in the way of self-determination, which is also recognized, by the way, by the international conventions like the UDHR?
The African Union is against any form of secession unless it's supported by the state, the mother state that the region is seceding from. So on the one hand, that simply reflects a long-standing principle in the African Union, and that's essentially the principle on which the African territorial order is based on, which is to maintain colonial boundaries. So in those instances where secession has been recognized, it has been so because the mother state has supported it. But of course, what makes Ethiopia unique is that the Ethiopian constitution allows this. So I would say, I would interpret the ambassador's statement as, on the one hand, simply stating a very long-standing principle of the African Union. On the other hand, it's a way of perhaps communicating to the Ethiopian government that they're not looking to break it up or work against it, sort of an appeasement of some sort. But at the end of the day, I don't think we should look to the African Union or anyone on matters of self-determination in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a very special country in Africa. Whereas the rest of Africa was an outcome of European colonialism, it is an outcome of African colonialism. And that's why we have the constitution that we have. And this is not a view held simply by or only by Tigrayans. This is a view held by Somalis, Oromos, and so forth. And thus, the reason why we have a special constitution that allows for self-determination up to secession. So essentially, I don't really see external actors being detrimental factor here, because if Abiy Ahmed and the Prosperity Party wants to get rid of the self-determination clause and wants to forcefully oppress and suppress the nations and nationalities of Ethiopia, we have to bear in mind that we are the majority. The people that support this constitution, the people that support the right to self-determination, I am quite confident is by far an absolute majority. And eventually, when we have a democratic process going, political forces that support this principle in this constitution will win. So essentially, this is really not up to the ambassador, although the ambassador is simply reiterating a long-held African principle. We in Ethiopia know, and we sort of acknowledge this across the board from different regions, that the Ethiopian state is an outcome of local indigenous colonialism by the Abyssinian Empire led by Emperor Menelik. Emperor Menelik expanded his empire across Ethiopia. He didn't do so through referendums. He did this by extreme violence and forcefully incorporated many different African nations into his empire. When the rest of Africa got their self-determination in the 1950s and 60s, Ethiopian nations that were suppressed were overlooked in that process. That's why we fought for our rights. That's why we fought for a couple of decades to win over the Derg and put in place this constitution. So I really don't think that this is something that concerns the ambassador, if I can put it that way.
Talking of the Federalist Forces, just this week, a new coalition has been formed by 7 political movements, Federalist movements, Federalist Forces. There was earlier also a similar, or at least the name itself, a Federalist Coalition Forces of Ethiopia. So how different is this? Do you think it is different? If so, why? And if not, why?
I think this is part of a more sort of broader historical reasons why this is happening now. First of all, Abiy Ahmed really made a promise to the Ethiopian people that he would democratize. He pretended to be someone who supports the constitution. He pretended to be an Oromo. He pretended to be a federalist. And the reason why these types of mobilizations are so slow is because we really didn't know what was going on until quite recently, the last year or two, for a lot of us. And he showed his true colors with this election. So that's why I think these formations are slowly emerging. And eventually, I think it's not so much about whether one particular coalition succeeds or not. I think there are, structural reasons why Abiy Ahmed's project cannot succeed. The idea of ethno-national self-determination is very much instilled and matured in a large section of the Ethiopian population. So it's really, if you go to Oromia, if you go to Somali region, these ideas have now matured to a point where they're taken for granted as something that cannot be compromised on. Secondly, Ethiopia's population is a very young population now. There are many technological and economic factors that make mobilizing rebellion much easier than it was in the past. So essentially, it will be very difficult for Abiy Ahmed to succeed with that project, regardless of whether particular coalition succeeds or not in challenging it.
Well, we have come to the end of the interview. Thank you, Dr. Goitom Gebreluel, for this very enlightening analysis and reflections.
Thank you for having me.